78 years ago, a young nurse in Montana vanished right after her night shift, disappearing without leaving any trace, leaving her family completely devastated and the community gripped by an obsession that lasted for decades. Authorities once suspected a woman who had a complicated relationship with the victim, but with no body, no vehicle, and almost no clues to follow, the investigation quickly reached a dead end. Yet, throughout the years that followed, one of Eleanor's relatives never gave up hope, always believing that the truth was still hidden somewhere in the gaps of the case, until one day, when an old object was unexpectedly dug up from the ground, a detail that everyone had overlooked came to light. A detail powerful enough to turn the entire case upside down and leave everyone involved stunned. Before diving deep into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you like this video, don't forget to hit subscribe. December 1947, Miles City was buried under thick snow and cold winds blowing down from the northern plains, sweeping through the narrow dirt roads and low buildings typical of a western Montana town. It was a time when locals were used to the cold, but still wary of harsh winter nights, where the lone yellow light in front of Holy Rosary Hospital was almost the only bright spot in the white and silent atmosphere. In that setting, Eleanor Reese, a young nurse accustomed to long shifts in the strict hospital environment, left work at the end of the evening. She walked out to the parking lot behind the building, where strong winds and falling snow limited visibility, then quickly headed to her personal car, the only means that allowed her to travel the long and desolate stretches connecting the hospital to the boarding house where she lived. As Eleanor drove away from the hospital grounds, everything still seemed normal according to her daily routine, and no one had reason to think this would be the last time they saw her. However, that night passed without any news or sign that Eleanor had made it home. The family began to notice something unusual when she didn't show up the next morning as planned. They tried following the places she usually stopped by, asking acquaintances, checking the boarding house, and calling the hospital to confirm, but all led to no clues. Bad weather made the initial search even harder, as roads were almost completely covered by fresh snow, erasing any traces that might have existed from the night before. After hours of trying without results, Eleanor's family had to accept that this was no longer a usual delay and decided to report the incident to the Custer County Sheriff's Office. When they entered the sheriff's office, the duty officer quickly contacted Sheriff Jack Wallace, who had experience handling many missing persons cases in Montana's harsh weather conditions, but also understood that each case had its own factors needing careful consideration. Wallace started by asking the family to provide all information related to Eleanor's daily route, from the familiar path between the boarding house and the hospital, the places she often stopped, to the people she had recent contact with. He carefully noted every detail about the time Eleanor left her shift, the personal car she used, a old but still reliably running blue Ford, and her recent state of mind according to relatives. The family confirmed that Eleanor had no habit of suddenly changing her route, let alone losing contact overnight without notice. This caught Wallace's attention, because such a traceless disappearance was usually not due to spontaneous changes. At the same time, he had to consider the weather factor, which was playing a major role. Strong winds, poor visibility, and thick snow could put any driver in danger, even someone familiar with Montana terrain like Eleanor. Wallace requested reports on road conditions on the main routes the previous night, while calling night patrol units to check if there was any information about accidents or abandoned vehicles along the way. No matching reports, making the case even more worrying. After recording all available information, Wallace officially opened investigation file number 47-213, marking the start of a prolonged search and verification process. He identified 3 initial investigation directions. First, the possibility of an accident or vehicle stuck in a remote area. Second, the possibility Eleanor encountered issues on the road due to weather or mechanical breakdown midway, and finally, the possibility the victim was blocked or involved in an unusual situation preventing her from returning home. Wallace listed areas to sweep immediately that day, including the entire route from the hospital to Eleanor's residence, side roads branching north of town, areas near the Yellowstone River, where skids often occurred, and rarely traveled dirt roads in winter. He also directed notifications to Custer County patrol units and neighboring counties to gather information if anyone had seen the blue Ford the previous night. After completing the initial intake phase, Sheriff Jack Wallace began deploying verification steps at Holy Rosary Hospital that same morning, aiming to clarify the final moments Eleanor Reese was seen at work. He met with the night shift supervisor, the charge nurse, and a few staff still present when Eleanor left the ward, asking them to recount everything they remembered, even small details often overlooked. Most confirmed that Eleanor finished her last shift without complaining or mentioning any special plans for the evening, but many admitted she seemed more pensive than usual, like she was thinking about something. One nurse on the same shift said she saw Eleanor standing longer than usual at the medication room door before changing into her coat, while a new employee thought she smiled politely, but her eyes looked a bit distant, which this person said was different from her usual focus. Wallace asked each to describe exactly when they saw Eleanor and their position in the minute she left the nursing area. From the statements, he reconstructed a relatively consistent sequence of events. Eleanor left the break room, walked through the south hallway leading to the parking lot, didn't talk to anyone after that, and showed no signs of difficulty moving. A hospital security guard was also interviewed. He said he saw a female figure in a light-colored coat pass through the parking lot a few minutes before Eleanor appeared, but due to limited lighting, he couldn't identify clearly. What caught Wallace's attention was that this statement matched another employee's vague recollection of a woman resembling Margaret Lindgren, an acquaintance of Eleanor's, near the back exit, though no one dared confirm. When asked if Eleanor showed any unusual behavior before leaving the work area, many could only say she seemed quieter, different from her usual open demeanor. One nurse recalled that during a short break, Eleanor sat by the window, looking out at the dark and windy weather, not joining the conversation as usual. Though not a clear sign of worry or fear, the difference in Eleanor's attitude was enough for Wallace to note in the file, as he knew small behavioral changes could sometimes reflect something that happened earlier. After finishing gathering statements, Wallace moved to verifying Eleanor's planned route. He requested hospital records to provide a list of staff ending shifts around the same time to see if anyone was going the same direction as her, but no one left too close to that time. Eleanor's family provided information that she usually took the shortest road connecting the hospital to the boarding house, crossing a few dirt sections and avoiding riverside areas because winter made the surface slippery. Wallace examined the local map and marked points where Eleanor likely passed, including frequent turns, lighted positions, and remote stretches where a vehicle could skid or break down with few noticing. A hospital employee suggested that sometimes Eleanor went north to buy items at a small grocery store before heading home, but this information was unverified. Wallace noted this possibility because if Eleanor deviated from her usual path, the search area needed expansion. He also recorded a technician's statement that he heard Eleanor's car engine running longer than usual before leaving the lot, possibly due to cold weather making it hard to start, which could delay her journey by a few to tens of minutes, opening the chance she encountered issues after leaving the hospital area. All this data was compiled by Wallace into the file for cross-referencing with subsequent search steps. By the end of the workday, he had created a relatively detailed model of Eleanor's last known journey. She left the hospital in strong wind and snow, without interacting with anyone in the parking lot, no clear signs of being followed, but unconfirmed reports of a woman nearby, and no clues suggesting intent to change her usual route. This data didn't provide clear answers, but it was the necessary foundation for Wallace to continue verifying high-risk areas and considering possibilities that Eleanor left her familiar route for reasons yet undetermined. On the following workday, Sheriff Jack Wallace shifted focus to sweeping the entire route Eleanor Reese might have taken after leaving the hospital, seeing this as a critical step to determine the chance of an accident or mechanical issue with the vehicle, especially in Montana's harsh weather. The location of Holy Rosary Hospital was near the center of Miles City, only a few miles from the boarding house Eleanor rented, mostly via dirt roads and a section of gravel leading to sparsely populated residential areas. The most direct route was straight from the hospital to the town's main road, then turning into a small road south, which Eleanor chose almost every day. Besides this route, there were two side roads locals sometimes used to avoid strong winds or snow-closed sections, but those were narrower and went deeper into dimly lit areas, requiring experienced drivers to observe in bad weather. Wallace marked all these points on the local map, while comparing with statements from family and hospital to outline the most reasonable search corridor. He mobilized patrol police combined with area rangers, dividing into 4 different teams to check each range by priority. First was the main route, where Eleanor was most likely to pass. Rangers looked for fresh tire tracks in the snow or compressed dirt sections, but thick snowfall overnight erased almost all traces. They shone flashlights on curved road sections where vehicles easily skidded, and checked every broken bush, but found no signs of a vehicle veering off or sliding. Search teams also examined roadside ditches and gutters, where vehicles had been stuck in winter before, but found nothing but thick ice and a few windsnapped branches. Wallace tasked the second team with sweeping the side road east of town, where some hospital staff said Eleanor sometimes stopped to buy personal items. This route was longer and less traveled, lit only by scattered streetlights, leading to sparse farmland. The search team checked along both sides, especially downhill sections toward pine forests, but results were similar. No new tire marks, no abrupt braking signs, no debris or dropped items. Meanwhile, the third team was assigned to check trails leading to the Yellowstone riverbank, where accidents often happened for those traveling at night or in limited visibility. Though Eleanor didn't usually go this way, Wallace still considered she might have changed routes for some reason. Rangers used boats along the riverbank and high-powered lights on rocky shores to look for collision signs. Another group walked the river edge, checking for slid soil or tire marks pulled downhill. However, thick snow and strong winds made searching difficult, and no details indicated Eleanor's car approached this area. The fourth team checked slopes and trails near the western forest area, where rough terrain easily caused loss of control. Searchers stopped at every suspicious point, carefully shining flashlights for signs of a vehicle crashing down or getting stuck. Sometimes they found snow depressions, but close inspection showed animal footprints or wind-blown snow. Wallace also requested checks at nearby small farms to verify if anyone saw the blue Ford the night Eleanor vanished, but all said nothing unusual. After a long day of sweeping, the search teams returned without any clues. Wallace compiled reports from all groups and reanalyzed accident possibilities. He concluded that if Eleanor had an accident on main routes, search forces would certainly have found some sign, even just disturbed snow or tire marks. This reduced the chance the victim skidded off the road or got stuck due to vehicle issues. Though not completely ruling out accidents in farther areas, Wallace noted the most suspicious point was not finding the car, as a Ford couldn't vanish completely in a few hours without intervention. With that data, he made a preliminary conclusion that random accident likelihood was low, and the investigation needed to consider possibilities beyond traffic incidents or mechanical problems. Based on the results of the route sweep and the fact that the possibility of an accident yielded virtually no specific signs, Sheriff Jack Wallace shifted his focus to identifying individuals directly or indirectly connected to Eleanor Reese, viewing this as the next step to determine whether her disappearance might stem from some conflict or complicated personal relationship. The first person brought into consideration was Henry Vale, Eleanor's legal husband. Although the family described their relationship as normal, Wallace knew that many missing persons cases originate from internal issues that outsiders do not notice. Preliminary inquiries from neighbors revealed that Eleanor and Henry had a major argument the previous week. Though no one knew the specific details, this was a key detail that compelled Wallace to place Henry on the priority interrogation list, even though there was no evidence yet pointing to his involvement in his wife's disappearance. In addition, Wallace had to consider Eleanor's relationship with Thomas Lindgren, a married man whom some hospital staff described as showing more than normal interest in Eleanor. One employee reported seeing Thomas in the hospital area in the late afternoon during the week Eleanor went missing, even though he had no clear reason to be there. When cross-referencing with unofficial information from acquaintances, Wallace noted the possibility of a complicated relationship between Thomas and Eleanor, though it could not yet be concluded whether it was one-sided or mutual. This in turn led to identifying a third potential person of interest, Margaret Lindgren, Thomas's wife. Margaret was described by a few hospital staff as having appeared near the hospital parking lot around the time Eleanor left her shift, though no one could confirm it for sure. This coincidence, combined with the possibility that she knew about her husband's relationship with Eleanor, meant Wallace could not overlook her. Furthermore, according to accounts from several townspeople, Margaret had previously shown discomfort when Eleanor's name was mentioned, though she never openly stated the reason. From a professional standpoint, Wallace assessed that Margaret might harbor negative emotions or silent conflicts with the young nurse. And this was enough to place her on the list of suspects needing verification. After compiling the three key individuals, Henry Vale, Thomas Lindgren, and Margaret Lindgren, Wallace observed that each had ambiguities in their statements or personal relationships with Eleanor, and their appearances in various accounts indicated the need for detailed interrogations. To ensure the investigation proceeded systematically, he created a priority interrogation list, with Henry ranked first as the closest person to the victim and the one with the most recent conflict in timing, followed by Thomas due to his potential involvement in Eleanor's emotional changes before her disappearance, and finally Margaret, who could be influenced by both personal emotions and family circumstances. In addition, Wallace added several secondary individuals to a reserve list, including colleagues present on the night Eleanor left her shift, a security guard who had seen a female figure near the parking lot, and an old friend of Eleanor's who was said to have had a minor conflict with her in the past. None of these names were direct suspects, but their presence in various pieces of information meant Wallace needed to screen them to avoid missing any details. Immediately after completing the identification of related individuals, Sheriff Jack Wallace redirected all resources to launching a wide-area search around Miles City and surrounding areas, considering this a critical step to determine whether Eleanor Reese had suffered an accident, become trapped somewhere, or deviated from her usual route in an unpredictable way. He mobilized the Custer County Police Force, rangers from the Yellowstone River area, along with many locals familiar with the terrain to form a mixed search team, capable of covering various types of terrain in a short time. This was the largest force Wallace had ever organized for a missing persons case, reflecting the severity he attributed to Eleanor's disappearance. The search team was divided into multiple groups by area, starting from the highest probability locations, based on information gathered from the family, the hospital, and Eleanor's usual travel routes. The town area was swept first to check if there were any traces indicating Eleanor was stuck in traffic or had deviated from her path due to an unexpected incident. However, the main roads in Miles City had been cleared of snow that morning, so no one saw unusual tire tracks or any objects matching a green Ford. After the town area, the search expanded to low dirt roads, where locals often traveled by pickup truck or horse, but there were no specific findings beyond a few unidentified depressions blurred by fresh snowfall. The ranger force was tasked with searching along the Yellowstone River bank, where winter often saw skids or vehicles losing control and falling down steep embankments. Rangers used boats to patrol the river and shone powerful lights on each rocky section of the bank, while other groups walked along the river to check for skid marks. They found a few long streaks where soil had been pushed down, but upon close inspection, these were just consequences of melting ice and snow from previous days, unrelated to any vehicle. Several steep slopes were also checked by lowering people down the rocky sides with safety ropes to look for impact signs, but this yielded no results. At the same time, the police force handling the Northern Pacific Railway area conducted sweeps along the train tracks, as Eleanor might have changed direction to avoid snow or take a shortcut and approached this area. The search team checked every utility pole, section of rail, and areas with obstructed views, but found no debris, brake marks, or anything indicating a vehicle had passed through. They only saw snowdrifts pushed into layers by the wind, with no investigative significance. To the west of town, the ponderosa pine forest with its many small trails and complex terrain was considered the most dangerous area. As if Eleanor had accidentally turned into one of these paths, the chances of the vehicle getting stuck or sliding into rock crevices would be high. Wallace deployed experienced rangers to lead the search team deep into the forest, equipped with flashlights, ropes, and old topographic maps. The guides noted a few areas where snow was compacted, but upon close examination, these were animal tracks or old vehicle marks from before Eleanor's disappearance. Search dogs were additionally deployed to increase detection chances. The dogs were allowed to smell Eleanor's belongings at home to identify her scent, then released in multiple directions from the hospital area and town entry-exit routes. However, the cold conditions and strong winds caused the scent to dissipate almost entirely, causing the dogs to quickly lose the trail. At a few points, they stopped at certain spots before changing direction, but upon thorough checks, there was no physical evidence or human traces. The search force also extended to farms near Miles City, asking residents if they had seen a vehicle or stranger passing by during the snowy night, but the answers were all the same. No one saw anything unusual. Only one farm owner reported hearing a loud engine running through at night, but could not confirm if it was Eleanor's vehicle due to the bad weather at the time. Throughout the first day of searching, the team noted several minor signs that could potentially be related. A section of snow pushed aside, a few unclear indentations along the roadside, and a tire track partially erased by wind. However, none were specific enough to confirm they were traces of the Ford Eleanor was driving. After the wide area search yielded no specific results, Sheriff Jack Wallace decided to focus entirely on what he considered the key element that could open a new investigative direction: Eleanor Reese's green Ford vehicle. From Wallace's experience, in most missing persons cases involving personal vehicle travel, locating the vehicle is often the step that leads to tracing the victim's whereabouts, even if the vehicle only appears as traces or fragments. However, in Eleanor's case, the vehicle had vanished completely, which Wallace assessed as abnormal to the point of not being dismissible. Starting the very next morning, he ordered the vehicle search expanded to the entire area bordering Miles City, including Rosebud, Powder River, Big Horn, and Fallon counties. Police units in those areas were provided detailed information about Eleanor's vehicle model, license plate, color, and condition, as described by the family. Traffic checkpoints were instructed to pay attention to any older Ford models entering or leaving the area in the short time after Eleanor's disappearance. In parallel, Wallace sent a small team to sweep the roads leading west and south, as these were directions the vehicle might have taken if someone deliberately drove it out of Custer County to avoid detection. Nevertheless, all units reported that no vehicle matching the description had been seen during the critical time period. Next, Wallace contacted all auto repair shops within a radius of more than 50 miles around Miles City. He requested that shop owners and mechanics note any vehicles with fresh paint, replaced parts, or suspicious damage in the past 2 days. Shops from the towns of Colstrip, Forsyth, Broadus, to small garages scattered on farms were all checked. However, no shop had taken in a green Ford or any vehicle with related signs. The mechanics were also asked about the possibility of a vehicle being disassembled or parts sold in a short time, but they all affirmed that this was unlikely, as it required time and specialized tools. Not to mention, completely disassembling a vehicle in a snowy night was impractical under low light and temperature conditions. Not wanting to miss other possibilities, Wallace also contacted several scrapyards and metal collection points along the railway line, but the yard owners all said they had not received any new vehicles in the past few days. One yard owner west of Miles City mentioned someone had inquired about selling an older vehicle the previous week, but when asked for more details, the person could not remember clearly, as no license plate or vehicle description was recorded. This lead was too vague to use. After all reports were compiled, The only clear fact was that no one had seen Eleanor's vehicle anywhere in the area, no shop had taken it in, no residents had seen it on the road the night of the disappearance, and there were no traces indicating the vehicle had broken down in a remote location. The complete absence of the vehicle led Wallace to consider the hypothesis that it had not been abandoned due to an accident but had been deliberately moved out of the area that same night or early the next morning by someone. With the snowfall conditions, if the vehicle was towed or pulled by another means, traces could have been covered, especially with strong winds and continuous fresh snow. However, moving an older Ford in such weather could not be done by a single person without leaving any signs, unless the perpetrator was very familiar with the terrain or had prepared in advance. Wallace noted all these possibilities and concluded that the vehicle's failure to appear in any search raised significant suspicion that it might have been hidden or moved intentionally, opening the direction to consider factors beyond ordinary accidents. After the search for Eleanor Reese's vehicle yielded no results whatsoever, Sheriff Jack Wallace returned to the list of related subjects to conduct formal interrogations, focusing on 3 individuals assessed as having direct or indirect connections to the victim, Henry Vale. Eleanor's husband, Thomas Lindgren, the man alleged to have an unusually close relationship with her, and Margaret Lindgren, Thomas's wife, who appeared in several accounts around the hospital area at the time Eleanor left her shift. Wallace aimed to determine if any logical inconsistencies in their statements could help narrow the scope of the investigation, especially after the vehicle trace suggested the possibility of intentional displacement. The first person interrogated was Henry Vale. He asserted that he was at home on the night Eleanor disappeared and went to bed early due to returning from a grueling shift at the local diner. However, when Wallace asked if anyone could confirm this, Henry admitted that he was alone at home at that time, with no witnesses, and the nearest neighbor over 100 meters away could not see any lights or hear any sounds on the windy night. Wallace noted the first inconsistency. Henry said he went to bed early, but a neighbor reported seeing light from their house window at a significantly later time, though unable to verify who was inside. This was not enough to conclude Henry was lying, but it was a point to consider. The second was Thomas Lindgren. During the interrogation, Thomas asserted that he was at home that evening, reading the newspaper and then repairing some tools in the shed, without leaving the house since early evening. However, a nearby neighbor provided informal information that he saw Thomas leave the house late at night, though he could not clearly see the vehicle. When Wallace asked Thomas about this, he completely denied it and said the neighbor might have been mistaken due to dim lighting or weather conditions. Wallace noted the second inconsistency. Thomas said he did not leave the house, but a witness said otherwise. This was noteworthy because Thomas could be mistaken for someone else, but combined with information that Thomas had appeared near the hospital in the week Eleanor disappeared, his statement needed further scrutiny. Finally, Margaret Lindgren was interrogated as someone who might have appeared in the hospital parking lot, based on accounts from 2 employees. Margaret asserted that she did not leave the house that evening and had no reason to go to the hospital. However, Wallace cross-referenced this statement with the description from a security guard who saw a woman in a light-colored coat walking past the parking lot near the time Eleanor left her shift. This person could not identify her, but the description of build and hair matched Margaret. When Wallace asked her if there was any possibility someone could mistake her, Margaret replied firmly that no and claimed the security guard saw someone else. But Wallace noted this as the third inconsistency. Margaret completely denied it, while descriptions from at least 2 informal sources coincided on the presence of a woman similar to her in the hospital area. After collecting all the statements, Wallace cross-referenced them with existing data from the hospital, routes, and neighbor information. Henry had an unverifiable time period, but no signs he left the house. Thomas had a statement contradicting a witness, and his appearance near the hospital the previous week was a detail to examine further. Margaret had a statement contradicting 2 hospital employees. But the certainty of these witnesses' accounts was too low to conclude. Wallace synthesized all 3 statements and found that all had ambiguous points or lacked verifiability, but none had statements clear or unusual enough to proceed with arrest. From a professional standpoint, he assessed that the feasibility of each statement remained intermediate. No one was completely ruled out as a suspect, but no one had direct evidence pointing to criminal activity. This made him more cautious in subsequent investigation steps, as imposing hypotheses without physical evidence and reliable witnesses could easily lead to misdirection. Wallace concluded the interrogation summary with the finding that there was no legal basis to charge any of the three subjects, while needing to expand the investigation in other directions to find additional information that could clarify the existing inconsistencies. After completing all the interrogation sessions and reviewing the information gathered over more than a week since Eleanor Reese's disappearance, Sheriff Jack Wallace was forced to confront the reality that the investigation was gradually reaching a deadlock. The search teams found no signs of Eleanor, despite scouring most areas she might have passed through, from the main route from the hospital to her residence, side dirt roads, to sparse forested areas, and the Yellowstone River banks. Nowhere yielded significant clues, no erratic vehicle tracks, no signs of collision, no abandoned personal items. Eleanor's blue Ford, the most critical vehicle for determining her direction of travel, had completely vanished, leaving no indication it had ever been on the road or abandoned in a remote spot. All efforts to contact neighboring counties, repair garages, scrapyards, and farm owners yielded no results. The vehicle seemed erased from the map in an unnatural way, leading Wallace to conclude that either it had been moved very far away, or the alternative was that it had been concealed in a manner making search nearly hopeless. On the human side, all three related subjects, Henry Vale, Thomas Lindgren, and Margaret Lindgren, had ambiguous points in their statements. However, the level of contradiction had not reached the threshold for strong measures. There was no direct or indirect evidence indicating their involvement in Eleanor's disappearance, and their statements, though not entirely consistent, could still be considered reasonable in the absence of verifying data. The hospital witnesses provided information about a woman's appearance near the parking lot, but no one could identify her or give a clear enough description, making these facts unusable as evidence. Information about Eleanor's personal relationships was also not strong enough to consider as motive, as there were no signs she had serious trouble or been threatened. Wallace synthesized all the investigation directions he and the team had pursued: wide area searches, route sweeps, inter-county coordination, vehicle checks, suspect interrogations, witness statement verifications, riverbank, trail, and forest area checks. None yielded any specific key. Search team reports described every minor detail about snow tracks, depressions, old tire marks, but all were deemed unrelated. All they had was the silence of the landscape and the void in the route Eleanor should have taken home. With no victim, no physical evidence, no vehicle, no credible witnesses, and no determination of Eleanor's final direction of travel, Wallace understood the investigation was entering a state where it could not advance further with traditional methods. He had to consider the limits of manpower and real conditions, especially as Montana's winter continued to hinder any new search efforts. Ultimately, at the end of the month, Wallace decided to note in the file that all investigation directions had been pursued to the fullest feasible extent, but yielded no results. Per Custer County procedure in 1947, disappearances without signs of foul play, physical evidence, or new information would be moved to unsolved. File number 47, 213 on Eleanor Reese's disappearance was officially classified as such, with a note that the case would be reopened if any new clues or evidence emerged in the future. This decision did not mean ending the investigation, but reflected the lack of new data to continue. For Wallace, signing the file transfer was a heavy step, as he knew each unsolved case was a reminder of law enforcement's helplessness before mysteries they could not explain. However, in the current context, he could do no more than wait for a new opportunity, one no one knew if it would ever come. In the decades after, File 47-213 was shelved as unsolved, Eleanor Reese's disappearance gradually became a silent part of local history. mentioned occasionally as an unresolved story rather than an ongoing investigation. From the early 1950s to the late 1980s, various minor tips were sent to the Custer County Sheriff's Office, mostly from locals or passers-through in Miles City who believed they saw someone resembling Eleanor or found an object possibly related to her. However, upon close examination, all these leads were eliminated, either for not matching the victim's identifying features or because the discovered object lacked sufficient connection to be added to the official file. At one point, an old Ford abandoned on the edge of a farm in Rosebud was reported by the landowner, but upon checking the chassis number and vehicle condition, investigators confirmed it was not Eleanor's. Similar cases appeared a few times over 30 years, but all only added layers of information leading to no breakthroughs. Some investigators in the county, especially new ones taking over, occasionally reopened File 47-213, hoping to spot something overlooked, but the file retained its initial emptiness: no victim, no physical evidence, no vehicle, and no signs. Eleanor left the area or met a specific incident. New notes added during each review shared the content that there was no new data to expand the investigation. Also during this time, many key witnesses from the initial phase began moving away or passing away, especially those working at the hospital the night Eleanor disappeared. Some hospital employee records were lost due to management changes, making verification of old accounts even harder. People living around the hospital parking lot or near Eleanor's usual route also gradually left Montana for work or economic reasons. As Wallace and investigators who worked directly on the case retired, knowledge of local details and initial context faded away, leaving only paperwork lacking depth for new personnel to fully understand what happened in the first days after Eleanor's disappearance. By the late 1980s, the case was hardly mentioned internally in the police, except when reviewing long cold files for archiving purposes. Eleanor's disappearance lay dormant in the file drawer, like a mystery without focus, lacking all data needed to form a clear hypothesis. But precisely because of that silence, File 47-213 continued to exist in a state of waiting, opening the slim possibility that one day, a new piece of information might unexpectedly appear to break the decades-long stagnation. In early June 2000, more than half a century after File 47-213 fell into silence, a road expansion project south of Billings inadvertently became the starting point for the biggest turning point in Eleanor Reese's disappearance. A crew hired to dig foundations for a new pipeline system in the suburban road discovered a strange object when the excavator hit unusually hard ground beneath the surface soil. Initially, they thought it was just a piece of metal debris or an item abandoned from years past. But while manually clearing soil to avoid damaging old pipes, one worker noticed the edge of a dark gray leather item. After digging more carefully, they pulled up an old women's handbag, covered in dirt around the seams, the leather rough from time and environmental exposure. Recognizing the object did not look like ordinary trash, the site supervisor instructed the crew to preserve the scene and report to Billings Police for inspection, due to concerns it might relate to an old case. When police officers arrived, they noted the bag was buried at a relatively shallow depth, not buried by machinery or modern construction, but appearing intentionally buried many years earlier. The bag's incomplete decay was due to the dry, stable soil with little groundwater impact. After sealing the evidence, officers took the bag to the investigation room for detailed examination. Upon opening it, they discovered a series of items inside, all dirty and showing long-term environmental damage, but intact enough for identification. Beside a handkerchief embroidered with the faded initials, ER, there was a small key ring, including a key for a Ford from the late 1930s production line. Additionally, there was a thin leather wallet containing torn papers. But when the examiner carefully separated the layers, an old driver's license processed with 1940s plastic film unexpectedly appeared. Though the photo was blurred to the point of being hard to recognize, the printed text was still legible enough to read the owner's name, Eleanor Reese. This immediately drew the Billings officer's attention because the name Eleanor Reese had appeared on Montana's long-term missing persons list. Other items in the bag, including a small metal mirror, a wooden comb, a few miscellaneous objects, and a torn piece of paper on which only the initial characters, EM, remained, were all catalogued as evidence for processing. When mapping the discovery location locally, Billings police noted a significant detail: the land under construction had belonged to the Lindgren family in the late 1940s and early 1950s, before they sold it to another farmer. This was not decisive information, but the emergence of evidence related to Eleanor Reese at a site directly linked to one of the subjects, once under scrutiny, was something investigators could not overlook. Also, during the bag examination, they noticed the zipper was broken, as if pulled forcefully or damaged externally before burial. This suggested the bag did not fall naturally, but was handled before being buried. The evidence, after initial checks in Billings, was transferred to the Central Forensics Lab for further analysis of the bag material, adhering soil and damage level to approximate the burial time. Preliminary soil analysis on the bag bottom showed it had lain in a naturally compacted layer for decades, not recently buried. This result aligned with the land being owned by the Lindgren family around the time of Eleanor's disappearance or shortly after. Recognizing the seriousness of this evidence type, Billings police immediately contacted the Custer County Sheriff's Office to report the discovery, as it was the agency that handled the 1947 disappearance investigation. File 47 Minders 213, forgotten for over half a century, was mentioned again in the first official contact since closure, marking the first time a real new datum appeared in a case previously without any foothold. However, to ensure objectivity and avoid missing details, all evidence remained in Billings for continued initial checks before full transfer to specialized units. The handbag's appearance after over 50 years not only shattered the long silence of the disappearance, but also opened a new possibility: the Eleanor Reese case might not have ended in the direction police in 1947 had assumed. It was from this buried bag, a relic seemingly just a remnant of the past, that a chain of new questions began to emerge, demanding a full re-examination of everything once recorded, overlooked, or never placed correctly in the picture of the case that had slumbered for half a century. When the information about the handbag buried in the ground in Billings was transferred to Custer County, File 47 Minders 213 was officially reopened for the first time in over 50 years. The person assigned to re-examine the entire case was investigator Claire Hanlon of the Billings Police Department, who had experience handling long cold cases and was accustomed to tracing information backward in investigations lacking physical evidence, witnesses, and filled with too many gaps. Claire began by requesting all original 1947 investigation documents, including scene reports, Sheriff Jack Wallace's notes, initial statements from family members, hospital staff, and the 3 subjects previously considered. The paper files were old, many pages yellowed, and some handwritten notes faded over time, but still sufficient to reconstruct the initial steps of the investigation. Claire read every line carefully, marking points related to travel routes, the time Eleanor left the hospital, and areas previously searched. She paid special attention to 3 details: Eleanor leaving the hospital on a night of bad weather, statements about the appearance of an unidentified woman in the parking lot, and the complete disappearance of the blue Ford, along with all of the victim's personal belongings. She then compared this information with the coordinates of the handbag discovery. The construction area in Billings, formerly owned by the Lindgren family, was located nearly 140 kilometers west of Miles City. This was not on any expected route for Eleanor if she left her shift and headed to her boarding house, nor was it a route to any location familiar to her. Logically, Eleanor had no personal or work-related reason to leave Miles City on the night of her disappearance, and certainly could not have taken the handbag to Billings and buried it herself. Claire noted this in her preliminary analysis report. The location of the new evidence is completely outside any reasonable route of the victim. This forced her to question the possibility that the bag was taken by someone after Eleanor's disappearance, and that person may have known the way to the land once owned by the Lindgren family. Continuing to review the file, Claire re-examined the route Sheriff Wallace had originally circled. The main road Eleanor typically used ran south of town, completely opposite the direction to Billings. If someone took Eleanor or just her handbag after the incident, that person would have deliberately headed west, crossing many sparsely populated rural roads. Claire compared this route with the 1947 residences of the three related subjects. Henry Vale's house was near the town center, while Thomas and Margaret Lindgren lived in the western part of Miles City, a closer direction toward Billings. She noted that if either of the Lindgrens traveled from Miles City to Billings at that time, they would have taken back roads with little traffic, ideal for moving a vehicle or concealing items without attracting attention. After remapping the routes, Claire proceeded to reconstruct the entire case timeline by combining 1947 data with the new evidence. She recorded the time Eleanor left her shift, the staff who saw her, weather conditions, the expected route, and when the family began searching. She then added the new layer, the estimated burial time of the bag, based on decomposition level, the bag's location on former Lindgren family land, and the possibility it was taken there between 1947 and the early 1950s. The new timeline began to take shape with many gaps filled. In the timeline model, Claire set milestone 0 as the moment Eleanor left the hospital, milestone 1 as when the family realized she had not returned home, milestone 2 as when search efforts were deployed, and milestone 3 as the period when the bag may have been buried. When cross-referencing these milestones with old data, Claire saw that all 1947 investigation directions focused on accident or sudden incident possibilities, while the new evidence indicated the victim or her belongings had been intentionally moved a very long distance from what was expected. Combining all data, Claire assessed that the handbag discovery was not only the first physical clue in over 50 years, but also a critical component in restructuring the entire sequence of events. It raised entirely new questions about Eleanor's final journey, and whether the investigation may have been misdirected from the very first days, due to factors no one at the time had the means to fully consider. The new timeline, though still containing many unexplained segments, created a fundamentally different foundation from the original file, ready for further analysis steps. Once the new timeline combining 1947 data with the newly discovered evidence was established, investigator Claire Hanlon moved to the next step, locating surviving witnesses, especially those who lived near Holy Rosary Hospital or worked there at the time of Eleanor Reese's disappearance. After more than half a century, the number of witnesses able to provide information had significantly decreased. Many had passed away, moved elsewhere, or suffered memory decline. Nevertheless, Claire decided to review the entire list of hospital personnel and area residents from the old file, then contact those individuals or families still listed in current residential records. One of the first people she located was Mrs. Lillian Meyer, a nurse intern in 1947 and now 85 years old. Though her memory was no longer sharp, she still recalled general features of the evening Eleanor left the hospital. She confirmed that at the time, the parking lot had very little lighting, and clearly seeing anyone moving at night was difficult, but she also remembered seeing a figure standing near the rear entrance area, not Eleanor. Around the same time the shift ended. When asked for more details, she could not identify the person but vaguely recalled the build resembling an adult woman, not hospital staff. This detail partially matched descriptions in the old file, prompting Claire to flag it for cross-referencing with other witnesses. Claire then located Mr. Conrad Ellis, who lived in the house across from the hospital's rear exit in 1947. Though over 90 years old, his memory of that time remained fairly clear, perhaps because Eleanor's disappearance had left a deep impression on their small community. He stated that on the night of the incident, he saw a car parked near the hospital area shortly before Eleanor left her shift. He remembered it was not Eleanor's car, but a light-colored sedan, similar in shape to an older Chevrolet model. When Claire asked if he recalled who owned such a vehicle at the time, he slowly replied that the Lindgren family, particularly Margaret, seemed to use a similar car in the 1940s. Claire noted this, as it aligned with informal hospital staff accounts of seeing a woman with a build like Margaret near the parking lot. However, both Mrs. Meyer and Mr. Ellis confirmed they did not clearly see the woman's face, due to poor lighting and continuous snowfall making distant observation nearly impossible to be completely accurate. Claire continued to meet another key witness, Mr. Paul Harrow, who had been a hospital security guard during Eleanor's disappearance. He had provided a 1947 statement about seeing a woman in a light-colored coat walking through the parking lot. When Claire presented the old transcript and asked if he could add anything based on current memory, Mr. Harrow said he was not certain who it was at the time, but had a feeling the woman was not hospital staff because she was not wearing the distinctive uniform. He also said the light-colored coat reminded him of a woman in town he had seen many times at morning markets, Margaret Lindgren. Though he would not confirm it due to unclear visibility, this detail still held value in strengthening the timeline sketch of someone possibly near Eleanor when she left the hospital. With new information from surviving witnesses, Claire cross-referenced it with Margaret Lindgren's 1947 statement. In the old file, Margaret claimed she was home all evening and did not leave town or go near the hospital. However, the fact that 3 independent witnesses all recalled the appearance of a woman with a similar appearance to Margaret in the same time frame, though each memory was vague, made Margaret's 1947 statement more suspicious. Claire also noted the anomaly when comparing with the handbag discovery route. The land once owned by the Lindgrens was very far from the hospital, and completely unrelated to Eleanor's normal travel, raising the question of whether Margaret may have been at the hospital to meet or follow Eleanor. Reviewing Thomas Lindgren's statement, Claire saw he had claimed not to leave home on the evening of Eleanor's disappearance, but a 1947 witness reported seeing a man's figure leaving the Lindgren residence. Though the information was not clear enough to confirm, the additional data about a suspicious woman's appearance near the hospital made the contradictions in both Thomas and Margaret's statements even more evident. Claire synthesized all the information. 3 witnesses who lived near the hospital all had overlapping memories of a woman near the parking lot. The woman may have worn a light-colored coat. One witness recalled a vehicle type matching the Lindgren family's car, and all of this contradicted Margaret's claim that she did not leave home. Reviewing these contradictions helped Claire restore critical context from the night of Eleanor's disappearance, reducing gaps left by the old file while creating a foundation for deeper analysis of the reasonableness of the related individuals' behavior and routes. Once sufficient information had been gathered from the surviving witnesses and cross-referenced with the old files, investigator Claire Hanlon shifted her focus to the most critical part of the reinvestigation phase, the forensic examination of the handbag discovered in Billings. This was the first tangible piece of evidence directly linked to Eleanor Reese after more than half a century, and therefore every detail, no matter how small, had to be scrutinized thoroughly. The Central Forensics Lab in Billings first conducted an analysis of the handbag's material. The results showed that the bag was made from cowhide leather processed using a manual method common in the late 1930s and early 1940s, matching the time frame when Eleanor owned it according to family accounts. Through decomposition testing, experts estimated that the bag had been buried underground for many decades, a period equivalent to the years since Eleanor's disappearance. The soil adhering to the bag was analyzed using mineral composition comparison methods, and the results revealed that the soil had a structure similar to the type characteristic of the eastern Billings area, particularly matching the land once owned by the Lindgren family in the late 1940s. This immediately became a key factor in evaluating the evidence origin, as it confirmed that the handbag was not simply abandoned randomly, but was very likely intentionally buried in an area where one of the original suspects had lived and used. Next, the lab carefully examined the fabric lining inside the bag experts discovered numerous tiny fabric fibers stuck inside the lining, possibly from contact with clothing while the bag was in use. When these fibers were compared to fabric samples from items still stored in the old evidence locker related to the Lindgren family, specifically a sample from Margaret Lindgren's coat that police had seized in a civil case in the early 1950s. The results showed similarities in fiber structure and dye color. Although the technology of the time did not allow for absolute determination of origin matching, the high degree of similarity between the two samples led Claire to note that the handbag may have come into contact with an item belonging to Margaret. This was not direct evidence but strengthened the connection between the bag and the Lindgren family land. In addition to the bag's material and fibers, the soil inside the bag, particularly at the bottom, was analyzed separately. Some soil patches showed signs of compression, different from natural overlying soil layers, indicating that the bag may have been placed on the ground before being covered by new soil, rather than being buried through natural processes. This increased the likelihood that the bag was buried by human hands. The lab continued to focus on the torn piece of paper found inside the bag. Although most of the content was no longer legible, the character M remained clear and were on paper material consistent with the type of handwriting paper used in the 1940s. Claire requested that handwriting experts compare the M sample on the paper fragment with old preserved documents, including signatures and statements from individuals involved in the 1947 case. Among them was Margaret Lindgren's handwriting, preserved by the local court in a minor land dispute in 1948. When experts compared stroke structure, letter slant, pen pressure, and character features, they found a high degree of similarity between the M sample on the paper and Margaret's handwriting. Although it could not be 100% confirmed due to the shortness of the character sample, the analysis results indicated that the probability of both samples being written by the same person was significant and could not be ignored. Additionally, knife marks on the edge of the paper fragment showed that it was torn hurriedly from a larger sheet, rather than naturally ripped. This raised questions that the paper may have once been part of a letter or some document and was handled before the bag was buried. When compiling all the forensic results, Claire realized that each individual detail was not enough to draw a firm conclusion, but when pieced together, they formed a clearer picture. Eleanor's handbag did not appear on its own on the Billings land. It was buried intentionally. The soil on the bag matched the soil in the area once owned by the Lindgren family. The fibers inside could have contacted Margaret's clothing, and the only remaining character on the paper showed significant similarity to her handwriting. Claire's preliminary conclusion was clearly recorded in the investigation report. The evidence has a high probability of being placed in a location directly related to the Lindgren family, not due to natural impact or coincidence. This indicates a connection between the evidence and at least one individual from this family. This was the first time in over 50 years that case file 47-13 had a specific link between evidence and an initial suspect, opening a crucial step in reconstructing what happened on the night Eleanor Reese disappeared. Once the forensic examination results were sufficient to show a significant connection between Eleanor Reese's handbag and the land once owned by the Lindgren family, investigator Claire Hanlon decided to proceed with the next critical step, re-interviewing Margaret Lindgren after 53 years since she gave her initial statement. At this point, Margaret was an elderly woman, with somewhat declining health but still lucid, living in a small house in the suburbs of Billings. Claire prepared thoroughly for the interview, bringing all the data from the 1947 file and the newly discovered evidence to ensure every contradictory point was fully cross-referenced. The interview began with Claire recounting Margaret's 1947 statement, in which she claimed she was home all evening when Eleanor disappeared and did not leave Miles City, nor did she appear near the hospital. Claire then presented information from the surviving witnesses, who remembered seeing a woman with a build similar to Margaret's in the hospital parking lot area during the time Eleanor left her shift. When confronting these accounts with the old statement, Margaret appeared confused, and said the witnesses might have remembered wrong or saw someone else. However, when Claire pointed out that 3 independent witnesses all gave matching descriptions, Margaret's reaction became more guarded, though she still maintained that she was not at the hospital that evening. Claire then moved to the most important part, presenting the new evidence. When the handbag was placed on the table, and Claire confirmed it was Eleanor's, Margaret showed a brief moment of unease, a reaction that Claire noted carefully. Next, when Claire explained that the bag was found on land once owned by the Lindgren family in the late 1940s, Margaret responded that she knew nothing about it and could not explain why the bag appeared there. Claire continued to present the forensic findings. The soil on the bag matched the composition of that area. The fibers inside the bag were similar to fabric once belonging to her, and the Mon characters on the paper had handwriting features similar to hers, according to expert analysis. Upon hearing this, Margaret reacted more strongly, claiming that the soil match was coincidental because Montana soil has many similarities, and the fibers could not be definitively determined due to the long time past. However, Claire pointed out that the comparison fabric sample was taken from an item belonging to Margaret herself and from the same era, something that could not be dismissed as mere coincidence. When asked about the characters on the paper, Margaret initially said she did not remember writing anything from that time, then suggested the paper might belong to someone else, and finally said she did not know why it was in Eleanor's bag. The shifts in her explanations made Claire clearly see the increasing level of inconsistency. To clarify further inconsistencies, Claire asked whether Margaret had ever visited the land where the bag was found around the late 1940s. Margaret admitted that her family lived there at that time, but still insisted she knew nothing about the bag being buried. When Claire mentioned that the bag was buried intentionally, rather than falling naturally, Margaret was silent for a long time before saying that someone might have used their land to hide the evidence. Claire followed up by asking that if someone did that, why they would choose the Lindgren family land when the Billings area at that time was vast and rarely checked. Margaret could not provide a reasonable answer. Claire continued to review the statement about where Margaret was on the evening Eleanor disappeared. When asked again if she had left the house, Margaret replied that she did not remember clearly because too much time had passed. This was completely contrary to her 1947 statement, when she firmly claimed she was home all evening. The change from "I was definitely home" to "I don't remember clearly" was a significant inconsistency that Claire immediately recorded in the report. When cross-referencing with information from a witness who saw a car with a style similar to the Lindgren family's parked near the hospital, Margaret said many people back then used similar cars, but Claire knew that in the Miles City area at that time, the number of cars of the same model and color was not so numerous that they could all be mistaken. Though not stated aloud, Claire understood that Margaret's reactions from evading direct answers, changing content, to inconsistent denials showed she was trying to control the narrative but failing. When the interview concluded, Claire compiled all the data and saw that Margaret completely lacked any basis to explain why Eleanor's evidence was on land once owned by her family, why the bag was intentionally buried, why the fibers inside matched her items, and why the handwriting on the paper had high similarity to hers. Moreover, the statements changing over time, especially about where she was on the night Eleanor disappeared, created a chain of inconsistencies that could not be ignored. The conclusion was recorded in the minutes. The primary suspect could not provide a reasonable explanation for the evidence directly related to the victim being found on land once owned by her family, and the statements have many inconsistent changes. This was a significant advancement in forming an assessment of Margaret's role in Eleanor Reese's disappearance. After the interrogation of Margaret Lindgren, and as the contradictions in her statements became increasingly apparent, investigator Claire Hanlon decided that it was necessary to expand the investigation directly at the old plot of land once owned by the Lindgren family, where Eleanor Reese's handbag had been discovered after more than half a century. This was a large area, now divided into multiple sections sold to individual residents and small businesses, but the central part still had undeveloped patches due to unstable geology. Claire coordinated with the Billings Police Department's Technical Support Unit to use ground-penetrating radar equipment to detect anomalies beneath the deeply compacted soil layers, particularly signs related to large metal objects. The area prioritized for initial surveying was the spot where the handbag was found, then expanded in an arc pattern to cover the entire old plot that the Lindgren family had used in the late 1940s. As the scanner began operating, the data displayed on the screen showed soil layers compacted in an unnatural direction, along with numerous anomalous reflection points that could be remnants of metal objects that had lain underground for a long time. A technician pointed out that there were multiple areas with reflection patterns characteristic of metal altered in shape by strong force impacts or high temperatures, which Claire immediately noted as it aligned with the hypothesis that a metal object, such as a vehicle, might have been buried or destroyed there. When expanding the survey scope to the western part of the land, the ground-penetrating radar revealed a large anomalous cluster deep in the soil with an elongated and flat shape, not a natural structure. The relative length and width of this cluster led the technicians to suspect that it had once been the frame of a large object, possibly belonging to a motorized vehicle. Claire requested that the excavation team dig a small probe hole at the edge of the anomaly to avoid disturbing the central area before more precise analysis. When digging down about more than 1 meter, they found small corroded metal fragments, some with traces of charring. The largest fragment among them had a curved shape and folded edge similar to the grille of a vehicle produced in the 1930s, 1940s. Immediately, Claire requested that the sample be sent to the analysis lab to check if it belonged to the Ford model that Eleanor used. While awaiting results, the team continued expanding the excavation area based on GPR guidance and discovered additional metal fragments, most in a heavily deformed state, showing signs of having been subjected to strong mechanical forces such as hammering, bending, or crushing. Some fragments still had a faded blue paint layer, matching the color of Eleanor's Ford as described in the 1947 records. This was a significant discovery that made Claire almost certain that Eleanor's vehicle had once been present on this land. When the analysis report from the forensics lab returned, the results confirmed that the metal structure, thickness, and composition of the found fragments matched the materials used by Ford in the late 1930s. One of the metal fragments, after cleaning, even revealed a portion of a worn chassis number that still retained a few characters. Although it did not fully match Eleanor's vehicle chassis number due to most of it having disappeared over time and external impacts, the remaining sample still showed similarity in the stamping style that Ford used for the model she owned. For further verification, Claire requested soil samples from various locations on the old plot to determine if there was consistency in depth, compaction, and mineral composition with the area where the metal fragments were found. The results showed that the disturbed soil layers within a radius of about 6 square meters all had clear signs of alteration in the same time period, consistent with a large object having been dug up, buried, or burned, and then reburied there. This further reinforced the hypothesis that the vehicle had been disassembled or destroyed right on the land owned by the Lindgren family at the time of Eleanor's disappearance. Another notable detail discovered by the technicians was the presence of microscopic metal ash in the deep soil layer. This ash was consistent with the oxidation reaction of metal when burned at high temperatures, a method commonly used in the 1940s to destroy vehicles or reduce the size of chassis frames to conceal or reuse materials. When cross-referencing the 1947 Caleb map, a detailed land map of Yellowstone County, Claire determined that the part of the land where the metal object was discovered had once been an empty lot behind the Lindgren family home. This not only matched in location, but was also logical in terms of behavior, because if someone wanted to hide Eleanor's vehicle, a private remote plot with little traffic would be an ideal spot. The scattered and deformed metal fragments also indicated the possibility that the vehicle had been manually disassembled before being burned or buried. From all this data, Claire concluded that Eleanor Reese's vehicle had not simply vanished as people had believed 50 years earlier, but very likely had been deliberately moved and destroyed right on the Lindgren family land shortly after the victim's disappearance. This was a groundbreaking conclusion, because now both the most important pieces of physical evidence, the handbag and traces of the vehicle, converged on the same location, a position tied to the primary suspect in the case. Although this could not yet pinpoint exactly what happened in 1947, it provided a clear foundation to establish that the discovery site of the evidence was not random, but directly related to intentional actions to conceal traces of this mysterious disappearance. After completing the forensic examinations and site surveys, investigator Claire Hanlon began the phase of synthesizing all the results to build an event model for Eleanor Reese's disappearance. A model that for the first time could be based on specific data rather than speculation, as in 1947. Claire's first step was to reconstruct the timeline of Eleanor's journey on the night of her disappearance based on hospital statements, weather data, family information, and the time she left her shift. Eleanor was last seen leaving the hospital in the late evening, with no signs of trouble while heading to the parking lot and no plans indicating she would deviate from her usual route home. Claire set this timestamp as the starting point and continued adding events based on statements from surviving witnesses, the appearance of a woman with a demeanor similar to Margaret Lindgren near the parking lot, information about a light-colored sedan resembling the Lindgren family vehicle parked near the hospital, and the complete disappearance of Eleanor's blue Ford right after she left her shift. Then, Claire cross-referenced this timeline with the location where the evidence was discovered in 2000. Eleanor's handbag was buried on the old Lindgren family land in Billings, a location completely off the route Eleanor could have taken. Claire noted that for Eleanor's evidence to appear there, someone must have transported it from Miles City to Billings shortly after she vanished. Additionally, the ground survey results showed that Eleanor's vehicle had been destroyed and buried right on this land. When pieced together, Claire had the first logical chain of events. The handbag and Eleanor's vehicle, two independent objects, both ended up in the same area owned by the primary suspect. This completely ruled out the possibility of a random accident or an unrelated person picking up the items and burying them. There was no reasonable explanation for the evidence appearing precisely at a point closely tied to Margaret Lindgren. Next, Claire built the event model based on verifiable facts. The victim left the hospital on a night of bad weather. There was the appearance of a woman matching Margaret's description in the parking lot area. Eleanor's vehicle disappeared from the usual route within a few hours. The victim's evidence was deliberately buried, and the vehicle was systematically destroyed. Claire proposed the hypothesis with the highest fit. After Eleanor left the hospital, she encountered Margaret near the parking lot, possibly a chance meeting or prearranged. The presence of the light-colored sedan, matching the Lindgren family vehicle, reinforced the likelihood that Margaret was at the scene. From there, Eleanor may have been persuaded or forced to deviate from her normal route, leading to her being taken in a completely different direction from home. Claire posited this because there were no signs of an accident on the main route, and Eleanor's vehicle never appeared in any search areas. The key part followed the evidence buried in Billings, and signs of the vehicle destroyed on the Lindgren land indicated deliberate concealment. Such an action required time, knowledge of the terrain, and access to private land, which the Lindgren family was the only suspect on the list to meet all those conditions. Claire modeled the chain of events as follows. Eleanor leaves the hospital, encounters one of the suspects, most likely Margaret, is led along a different route toward Billings. The handbag is taken, the vehicle is moved to the Lindgren land. The vehicle is disassembled and destroyed. Personal evidence is buried to conceal the victim's presence. When each step in the model was cross-checked against each data point, no detail contradicted the logical progression. On the contrary, all aligned with the forensic results, witness statements, and the complete disappearance of both the victim and the vehicle. After finalizing the model, Claire issued the investigation conclusion. All physical evidence and indirect data converged to indicate that Margaret Lindgren played a role in causing Eleanor Reese to disappear, and subsequently concealing the evidence. The contradictions in Margaret's statements, her suspicious presence near the scene, along with the evidence found on her family land, made it clear that the primary suspect not only lacked a reasonable explanation, but was at the center of the entire event model. With the case model established and all new facts converging on a single point, the Lindgren family land, along with the stark contradictions in Margaret's statements, investigator Claire Hanlon submitted the full report to the Yellowstone County Prosecutor's Office for consideration of an arrest warrant. The hundreds-page report compiled all physical evidence, forensic examinations, surviving witness statements, old scene analysis, land data, and anomalies in Margaret Lindgren's statements from 1947 to 2000. After review, the prosecutor concluded that although Eleanor Reese's disappearance occurred more than half a century ago, and the body was never found, the degree of connection between Margaret and the evidence was sufficient to constitute serious charges. The county court approved the arrest warrant in late June 2000, based on 4 charges: aggravated kidnapping, unlawful restraint leading to disappearance, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. These were charges that allowed arrest even without a body, especially when evidence showed intentional acts of kidnapping, deprivation of liberty, and evidence concealment. One morning in early July, the Billings Police coordinated with Custer County Police to arrive at the home where Margaret Lindgren lived. Despite her advanced age, Margaret still lived alone in a quiet house on the edge of the city. Claire Hanlon was present in the arrest team, as she had followed the case from the start of the reinvestigation and understood every related detail best. When the police knocked, Margaret opened the door with a look of surprise. Claire stepped forward, presented the arrest warrant, and announced the charges in a clear voice, without letting emotion interfere. Margaret, with a slight tremble, denied all accusations and said this was surely a mistake, but the police proceeded with the protocol as required. As the handcuffs were placed on Margaret's wrists, Claire noticed she did not resist strongly, but her tense eyes showed she understood the gravity of the situation. After reading all legal rights, the authorities escorted her into the patrol car. The neighbors, most unaware of the long-ago case, watched with curious and incredulous eyes. Margaret was taken to the Billings Police Headquarters for initial procedures before transfer to the county detention facility. The charges were read to her again, this time with the presence of a lawyer hastily hired by her family. The first charge, aggravated kidnapping, was based on the investigation's belief that Margaret had deprived Eleanor of her liberty on the night she disappeared. The second charge, unlawful restraint leading to disappearance, reflected that this deprivation led to Eleanor's vanishing without being found or explained. The third charge, tampering with evidence, centered on Eleanor's evidence, the handbag and Ford vehicle, having been deliberately moved, destroyed, or buried on land under the Lindgren family's control. Finally, the charge of obstruction of justice reflected Margaret's provision of false statements in the past and continued obstruction of the investigation by concealing or not disclosing related information. During the post-arrest interrogation, Margaret continued to deny any involvement in Eleanor Reese's disappearance, insisting that she did not bury the handbag, knew nothing about the vehicle, and was not at the hospital on the night in 1947. However, each time asked to explain why the evidence appeared on her family land, Margaret only repeated that she didn't know, or it was a coincidence. Claire noted that in each confrontation, Margaret avoided details and provided no evidence to refute the investigation's conclusion. In the final record of the arrest section, Claire clearly stated that the degree of connection between the primary suspect and the evidence could not be explained by chance, and Margaret's changing statements at various points further reinforced the assessment that she played a key role in Eleanor Reese's disappearance. The execution of the arrest warrant marked the most significant development in the entire case since Eleanor's disappearance, and it confirmed that after more than 50 years, the primary suspect finally had to face legal accountability corresponding to the alleged acts. The trial of Margaret Lindgren opened in late 2000 at the Yellowstone County Courthouse, drawing attention from local media, Due to the unusual nature of the case, a missing person file from 1947 resurfaced after more than half a century, thanks to a piece of evidence discovered by chance. At the trial, the prosecution began by systematically presenting the entire new investigation process, focusing on the evidence found in 2000 and the related forensic examination results. Eleanor Reese's handbag was placed before the jury as the key evidence described by the prosecutor as the first piece that broke the silence, lasting 53 years. The prosecution emphasized that the location where the bag was found, the land once owned by the Lindgren family, could not be considered random, especially since the soil adhering to the bag matched the geological structure of the area and indicated that the bag had been buried intentionally. Next, the prosecution presented the full forensic analysis. Fabric fibers inside the bag matched samples from Margaret Lindgren's belongings. Microscopic metal ash and deformed metal fragments found underground had characteristics consistent with a 1940 Ford vehicle, the type Eleanor used on the night she disappeared. One large metal piece even bore traces of a chassis number stamped in the Ford style of that era. The prosecution concluded that the car had been destroyed and buried on the property, which could only have happened if the perpetrator had access to and control over the area at that time. After the physical evidence portion, the prosecution shifted to analyzing inconsistencies in Margaret's statements between 1947 and 2000. They presented the original statement transcript, in which Margaret firmly asserted that she was at home on the night Eleanor disappeared and did not leave Miles City. The prosecution then introduced Margaret's new statement, where she said she didn't remember clearly and might have been mistaken because so much time had passed, a significant change that the prosecution described as a sign that the initial statement was untruthful. In addition, the prosecution presented testimony from surviving witnesses who said they had seen a woman resembling Margaret near the hospital on the night Eleanor left her shift. Although no one could confirm the identity with certainty, the prosecution argued that the match in descriptions, combined with the location of the evidence, made Margaret's denial hard to believe. The prosecution continued to prove evidence tampering by presenting ground-penetrating survey data. Images from the GPR scanning device showed a large metal object that had been disassembled, burned and buried directly underground in the area once owned by the Lindgren family. Analysis of the metal and soil showed this was a deliberate, systematic act, not a natural occurrence. Police presented a diagram of the burial pit, the excavated car parts, and posed a question to the jury: if Margaret was not involved, why was evidence related to the victim located in the only area that she and her family had the authority to access at that time? The prosecution also emphasized that destroying the car, a large and heavy vehicle, could not have been done randomly on private property without the oversight or involvement of those living there. In concluding their presentation, the prosecution argued that the act of concealing evidence was not just an attempt to erase traces of the vehicle, but also to perpetuate the silence surrounding the disappearance, lasting over 50 years. For their part, the defense focused much of their argument on the fact that Eleanor Reese's body was never found. Asserting that this made the entire accusation speculative, the defense argued that there was no direct evidence proving Eleanor was harmed by Margaret, and finding the evidence on the old property was not enough to conclude that Margaret was responsible. They also questioned the accuracy of witness memories after more than 50 years, suggesting that any description of the woman near the hospital could be influenced by the long passage of time and vague recollections. The defense attorney emphasized that the Billings area at that time was not overly populated, but it wasn't so sparse that only one family owned a sedan matching the witness's description. They argued that coincidences in car type or light-colored coat were entirely possible. Finally, the defense stressed that the prosecution's chain of reasoning relied on indirect pieces of evidence, with no direct witnesses, no record of violence, and no body to determine the cause of disappearance. They claimed that the prosecution's entire conclusion was based on a chain of high probabilities rather than certainty, and thus under the law, not sufficient to convict. However, as the arguments concluded, it was clear that the jury had to weigh two sides. On one hand, the collection of physical evidence, inconsistencies in statements, and the concentration of evidence in a single location; on the other, arguments based on the absence of a body and the uncertainty of witness memories. Each piece of information presented by the prosecution complemented the others, while the defense's arguments relied on denial but failed to provide an alternative explanation for the prominent evidence. The trial ended with high tension as both sides had presented their full arguments, leaving the final decision to the jury, those who had to evaluate whether the chain of indirect but consistent evidence was convincing enough to close a mystery that had lingered for more than half a century. After 2 days of deliberation, the Yellowstone County courtroom was packed when the jury entered, carrying the final decision for a case many thought would never have an answer. The judge asked the jury foreperson to stand and read the verdict. Based on the compilation of physical evidence found in 2000, forensic analysis confirming a direct link between the evidence and the land once owned by the Lindgren family, burned metal fragments matching Eleanor's Ford handwriting comparison results, along with the stark inconsistencies in Margaret's statements between 1947 and 2000, the jury concluded that this chain of indirect but consistent evidence was sufficient to meet the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. Accordingly, they found Margaret Lindgren guilty of aggravated kidnapping for depriving Eleanor of her liberty on the night she disappeared, unlawful restraint leading to disappearance for actions that led to the victim vanishing and being unfindable, tampering with evidence for participating in concealing, moving, and destroying evidence, including the handbag and the vehicle, and obstruction of justice for providing false statements, hindering the investigation, and maintaining the cover-up for more than half a century. As the verdict was read, Margaret sat silently, her eyes no longer holding the confidence she had shown in the early interrogation sessions. She neither cried nor showed a strong reaction, only bowing her head as the judge proceeded to sentencing. Based on the severity of the actions, the prolonged cover-up, and the irreversible consequences for the victim, the prosecution recommended the maximum sentence for each charge. However, considering the defendant's age, a woman in the final years of her life, the court imposed a combined sentence equivalent to life imprisonment, as any long-term sentence would have the same practical effect. The judge emphasized that the failure to find the body did not diminish the defendant's legal responsibility, as the evidence and investigation results formed a clear chain of data reflecting deliberate actions to conceal Eleanor Reese's disappearance. He affirmed that Montana law allows conviction in cases without a body when the evidence is sufficiently convincing, and this was a rare but necessary example to ensure justice was served. When the gavel fell, Margaret Lindgren was officially sentenced to imprisonment for no less than 70 years, equivalent to a life sentence in practice. Those present in the courtroom fell silent as she was led away, while the prosecution representative reiterated that this verdict was not only the end of a case spanning more than half a century, but also an affirmation that crimes, no matter how carefully concealed, could still be exposed when the time and evidence aligned. When the court's verdict was announced, and Margaret Lindgren was sentenced to a term equivalent to life imprisonment, the Eleanor Reese disappearance case, after more than half a century, officially entered its final phase. The Custer County Sheriff's Office, in coordination with Billings Police, completed the procedures to close the file, and in a brief summary session held at the end of 2000, file number 47-213 was updated to solved status after 53 years since it was first opened. The investigators involved in the reinvestigation phase, led by Claire Hanlon, prepared a comprehensive report documenting the entire process from the moment the handbag was found to the court's final verdict. The report emphasized that the case was solved not through a confession or the discovery of the victim's body, but through the precise matching and tight linkage of physical evidence, modern forensic analysis, and accurate timeline reconstruction, allowing the scattered information from 1947 to be pieced together into a complete sequence of events. Archiving was carried out carefully. Evidence items such as the handbag, keys, piece of paper, along with photographs of the metal fragments excavated from the Lindgren property, were all sealed and transferred to long-term storage. These documents not only held legal value, but were also evaluated as precious resources for studying cold case investigation techniques. Montana law enforcement agencies proposed including the case in the list of model examples for training new investigators, emphasizing the use of modern forensic technologies to supplement old investigations that lacked conditions. Internal documents highlighted that the success of Case 47-213 was clear proof of the importance of long-term record preservation, reviewing unsolved cases, and applying new technology to unlock seemingly inaccessible cases. The summary report affirmed that the most critical factor in cracking the case was cross-referencing the original timeline with new physical evidence data. The handbag being discovered in a location unrelated to Eleanor's route but directly tied to the prime suspect's land opened an entirely new investigative direction. When combined with the confirmation that the car was destroyed right on that property, along with the decades-long inconsistencies in Margaret's statements, the entire picture of the case became clear enough for a legal conclusion. Finally, in the closing notes of the file, Claire Hanlon wrote that the Eleanor Reese case was a typical example of how time does not necessarily bury the truth. On the contrary, in some cases, only when time passes, technology advances, and perspectives change, can secrets be revealed. When the solved stamp was placed on the cover of file 47-213, the case not only ended as a legal process, but also became a symbol of the relentless efforts of multiple generations of investigators seeking to provide answers to a story that seemed to have faded into oblivion for more than half a century. The Eleanor Reese case, with its journey of more than half a century, from disappearance to resolution, reflects many issues that remain very relevant in American life today, from the importance of transparency in communities to the essential role of forensic science and civic responsibility. The story shows that a secret concealed as thoroughly as Eleanor's handbag, buried in the old Lindgren family land, or the car deliberately destroyed, can ultimately still be exposed when society persistently asks questions and when technology is advanced enough to illuminate the past. This reminds us that justice does not always come immediately, but persistence, similar to investigator Claire Hanlon's efforts in reviewing the 1947 file and cross-referencing old statements with new evidence, can change the outcome of a case thought to be forgotten. In real-life America today, where tens of thousands of missing persons and unsolved murder files still sit in storage, this story underscores the value of preserving records and encouraging investigative agencies to maintain efforts to reopen cold cases when conditions allow. For each individual, the important lesson lies in recognizing that acts of concealment, whether stemming from anger, jealousy, or fear like Margaret Lindgren's deliberate destruction of the car and burial of the handbag, always carry long-term consequences. The story also encourages community proactivity. The surviving witnesses, who provided information in 2000, even if just vague memories of a light-colored car or a figure in a light coat, contributed to recreating a crucial piece of the puzzle. In modern society, where people easily overlook small details, being willing to share information when needed can become a decisive action. Ultimately, the story of Eleanor Reese reminds us that the truth may take many years to surface, but the responsibility of each individual and societal progress will always be two indispensable factors in delivering justice and closing prolonged losses. If you're interested in seemingly hopeless case-breaking journeys like the Eleanor Reese case, after 53 years in cold storage, please hit subscribe so you don't miss any stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue searching for truths hidden under the dust of time.